When the door opened, the air inside changed instantly. The lights were still as bright, the coffee still steaming, but the steps of the woman who entered quietly shifted everything. She wasn't wearing high heels, nor did she carry a designer bag. She had on a simple gray skirt and a blouse that had seen better days. Her hair was gathered in a careless yet clean way. She didn't have anything about her that stood out except for the plain file she was holding. But it was precisely this simplicity that fueled the cold mockery that filled the room. The HR director, with her red-tipped fingers tapping on the edge of her desk, tilted her head slightly and whispered loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She looks like she came dressed from the lost and found box." This comment triggered a laugh from one of the other candidates. A young man named Luca, with his navy-striped suit and slicked-back hair, rolled his eyes and said, "We came here to interview, not to start a charity campaign." Laughter began. The chuckles were not filled with genuine joy, but rather the irresistible lightness of looking down from above. The young woman's name was Hannah. She pressed her file to her chest and waited in silence. She didn't avert her eyes, nor did her shoulders drop. It was as if their words were not directed at her, but at each other. And indeed, they weren't, because no one in that room knew who Hannah was. No one knew she was married to the man who built this company from the ground up. No one knew her fingerprint was all over the software infrastructure of this company. And perhaps most importantly, no one had realized she had started this game years ago. Stormex Tech, a massive tech temple made of steel and glass. Every floor, every wire touched by innovation. Reaching the top in this tower was as hard as earning a god's mercy. Hannah had quietly stepped into the interview room on the 40th floor of this giant. The glass panels surrounding the room offered a generous view of the city below. At the head of the table sat 5 people. They had already evaluated Hannah the moment she entered, and the verdict was clear. But Hannah didn't need their judgment. She already knew who she was. At the front, the woman in the red jacket sitting upright was Diana, the HR director. Her face was stern, as if every word she spoke had passed a sharpness test. Beside her, Greg, a senior executive, kept turning his luxury watch. The others, Luca, the investor's son, Laura, the strategy expert, and Mark, the operations head, had already marked her as lost with the looks they had cast upon her. This was the final stage of the application process. Hundreds had been eliminated, leaving only 2, Hannah and Luca. But for those who noticed Hannah's silence when she entered, the competition had already ended. Greg smirked without even taking the file in his hand. "Looks like someone forgot to cancel this interview." Diana took the file, sighed, skimmed through it with a side glance, then pushed it back toward Greg. He threw the file onto the table, and papers landed in front of Hannah. No relevant experience. Average education. Wrong department. Tell me, why do you think you're a good fit for this company? His voice was venomous, as though Hannah had stained the room. Hannah broke her silence. Her voice was calm. "I've been developing sustainable systems for 8 years. My last startup tripled its revenue on its own. I can solve the problems Stormex hasn't yet defined." Luca interrupted with a laugh. "Sustainable systems? Did you set up a lemonade stand?" Diana rolled her eyes mockingly. "You must be imagining yourself inside a great CV." Laura adjusted her glasses and pursed her lips. "What was your major?" Hannah replied, "Computer engineering, focusing on artificial intelligence ethics." Mark grumbled. "Published papers. Like we need that. We need results." Diana grabbed a pen from her desk. She wrote one word in large letters across Hannah's resume. Insufficient. The ink smeared onto Hannah's palms as it spilled over the paper. Greg clapped. "Great. I think we've found the headline." Laura took a selfie. Luca yelled, "Frame this." A total failure portrait. But Hannah still stood tall. Her silence no longer smelled of helplessness, but of threat. Diana's pen was still in her hand, but the difference between its trembling fingers and Hannah's face was as clear as night and day. Laura stapled the papers together and threw them. Mark bent down and kicked them. Greg suddenly said, "All right, solve an algorithmic problem right now," slamming a thick test folder onto the table. With paper and pen, no computer, Hannah took the folder. Her voice didn't waver, her hand didn't shake. 5 minutes later, the test was complete. Greg grabbed the file with Hannah's answers, split it in half without looking, and threw it in the trash. Luca grabbed the pitcher in the middle of the table and poured ice-cold water over Hannah's head. As the water soaked her hair and blouse, He laughed mockingly. Go cool off a bit. But Hannah didn't budge. As the water dripped from her cheeks, her eyes remained just as steady. She didn't get angry. She didn't run away. She simply wiped her face, gathered her papers, and walked out without looking back. Because this was just the beginning. The real game, no one had seen yet. As the elevator doors closed, the mocking echoes of laughter that surrounded Hannah still rang in her ears. The coldness of her wet blouse clung to her skin, but there wasn't the slightest tremor on her face. The last words she heard, the condescending voice of Greg, Luca's laughter, Diana's victorious gaze, were all left behind. Hannah walked quietly through the marble-floored lobby of the building. People around her stared, some with curiosity, others with contempt, but she paid them no mind. Because Hannah now had something else on her mind. It was time to play her real cards. When she stepped outside, the sun gently caressed her face. Despite the weight of the cold water, her posture remained unchanged. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an old, small phone. She didn't hesitate to dial. Her fingers tapped out the familiar number. The phone picked up on the first ring. Elias, she said in a quiet but clear voice. It's over here. The silence on the other end turned into a brief, determined response. I'm on my way. Hannah hung up the phone. At that moment, she briefly glanced at her reflection in the building's glass facade. Wet hair, a scattered file, coffee stains on her blouse. She looked like she had lost. But what her eyes reflected in that moment said something else. A storm was about to brew, and no one could stop it. Minutes later, a flurry of activity began on the top floor of the building. Phones rang, executives whispered among themselves, and meeting rooms filled and emptied. Everyone could feel that something was wrong, but no one knew exactly what was happening. Special management meeting, one of the secretaries shouted as she hurried with files in her hands. Right now, everyone, Diana, Greg, Luca, Laura, and Mark exchanged confused glances when their names were called. This sudden summons was unusual. Such urgent meetings were typically held for either a major acquisition or a serious crisis. But deep down, each of them felt something was off. Still, their arrogance suppressed their fears. After all, they considered themselves untouchable. They were Stormex Tech's brightest stars, weren't they? When they arrived in the meeting room, the large glass doors opened quietly. The room was dark, with only the light from the giant screen in the center of the table illuminating it. As usual, Diana moved to the front. Greg was grinning. Luca tried to look indifferent. Laura adjusted her glasses, and Mark was fiddling with his watch. Each of them wanted to believe this meeting was a new opportunity for a promotion. After all, no one wants to admit that their place is at risk when in the middle of a disaster. Then, the doors opened again, and Elias Storm walked in. Hannah was walking beside him. Still the same wet blouse, still the same simple skirt, still the same hands without a file. But now, the man walking beside Hannah changed the energy of the room. Elias Storm, the quiet giant of the tech world. A man who had built his wealth not through flaunting it, but through quiet determination. No one had seen him directly in a long time. His existence had become a legend. The founder, CEO, and Hannah's husband. When he entered the room, everyone stood up. Chairs creaked, some bowed slightly. Diana's smile froze. Greg's pen slipped from his hand. Luca, Laura, and Mark instinctively clung to their chairs. Hannah, however, walked with her head held high. Her wet blouse and disheveled appearance were no longer a source of shame, but a shield of silence. Elias scanned the room slowly. He walked to the head of the table and spoke just one word. Sit. His voice carried such weight that no one dared to object. They all silently sat back in their chairs. Breaths were held. Eyes shifted from one to the other. The power of truth filled the room before it was even spoken. Elias turned his head and looked at Hannah. She gave a slight nod. Between them, there was an unspoken agreement that no one else could understand. The silent revenge had begun. Elias took a deep breath and fixed his gaze on Diana. 1 day ago, he said, his voice cold but calm in a deadly way. One candidate fought for an opportunity in this room. Your job was to see the potential. But you, his words hung in the air. Then, silence. Crushing, unbearable silence. This wasn't just the moment of a job interview. It was the moment the values of an empire were being judged. And this was only the beginning. The 5 people sitting at that table, just a few hours ago, each of them thought they were the backbone of this company. But now, In the face of Elias Storm's icy stare, they all seemed to shrink further into their chairs. When Elias' voice rose again, it wasn't the calmness of his tone that was frightening, it was the sharpness beneath that calm. I gave you a chance. I trusted you. I gave you all the authority you needed to identify the visionary leaders who would move this company forward. But what did you do? No one responded. Diana's lips trembled. Greg's forehead was sweating. Luca, for the first time, avoided eye contact. Laura's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Mark, once again, checked his watch, but this time, it wouldn't be the time that saved him, it would be helplessness. Elias continued. You were supposed to review every CV we sent you and assess each candidate objectively. But instead, you dismissed the brightest minds based on their appearance. Not only did you judge, you belittled, mocked, and ridiculed. A signal flashed on the screen. A technician, carrying a device, activated the large screen. The first image showed Hannah. The moment she walked into the meeting room. Then came Luca's laugh, Greg's words, Diana's insufficient stamp, and the stapler that Laura had thrown. They all played back, one after the other. The images hit the room like an echo that would never return. Every laugh now felt like a scream. Every belittling word now was a shovel strike digging their own graves. As the video faded to silence, Elias stepped forward and examined their faces one by one. Images don't lie, and these weren't just played here. Our investors are watching this live. Our shareholders too. The press. The world is watching how you all truly are. Greg cleared his throat, but no sound came out. Diana wanted to speak, but the words were stuck in her mouth. Laura wiped her glasses. Mark lowered his head. Elias continued sharply. You looked at what Hannah was wearing, but you didn't see the code she wrote. That code forms the foundation of the system that today earns you millions of dollars. Her intelligence was overshadowed by your arrogance. But now, there's no shadow left. Hannah remained silent. But this silence wasn't just silence, it was like a slap. Every second she stood there without saying a word, it created a new moment of shame for everyone in the room. Elias turned his head to Hannah and, in a softer tone, asked, Are you ready? Hannah slowly nodded. Elias turned back to the executives. I'm giving you one more chance. Repeat what you said yesterday, here, in front of the cameras. While looking at Hannah's face, Diana's color drained. I don't remember, she whispered. No, Elias replied, his voice hardening. You can't forget, because that day was the day your career ended. Laura quickly interrupted. But we didn't know who she was. And if you hadn't known, would you have evaluated her differently? Would you have ignored her essence just because of power? That's the problem right there. Luca leaned forward in his chair, opened his mouth, but Elias raised his hand to silence him. Don't speak anymore. You've spoken enough. And you've shown enough. At that moment, Elias turned to the technical staff and gave a single command. Send the files. The screen lit up again. This time, each executive's employment contract, termination notice, and dismissal documents appeared on the screen. Their names were written in bold letters. Diana, Greg, Luca, Laura, Mark. And at the bottom of the screen, a note from the internal system read, Immediate termination due to unauthorized actions, damage to corporate reputation, and discrimination. Laura put her hand over her mouth. Greg tried to stand up, but Elias stopped him with a single glance. Diana was frozen in her chair. You didn't just lose your jobs, Elias said. You lost your reputations. And when you walk out of this room, there will be nothing left but examples. Examples of what should never be done. Elias gave a signal. The same security guards who had escorted Hannah and earlier were now there to escort these 5 out. One by one, they were led out of the room. Greg's luxury watch was hanging loosely from his wrist. Diana's red jacket was no longer a symbol of authority, but a symbol of shame. Luca had his head down. Laura was biting her lip to keep from crying. Mark seemed to shrink further with every step. Before the door closed, Elias spoke one last time. StormX Tech rewards character, not arrogance. And now, the world will know the difference. The doors closed, and only 2 people remained in the room, a CEO and, for years, the quiet but unshakable woman who had stood behind every success. When the heavy doors of the meeting room closed, the atmosphere inside changed completely. The only ones left, Elias and Hannah, looked at each other in silence. No words were needed. In this silence, there were 2 things, honor and justice. But the impact of that moment didn't stay confined to just this room. Within moments, the announcement marked urgent spread across StormX Tech's internal communication system, flashing across screens one by one. Employees lifted their heads from their desks, phones started ringing, and whispers began spreading from ear to ear. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt it. A turning point in the company's history had just occurred. And soon enough, the storm spilled out to the outside world. No press releases were made. There was no need, because the footage from the meeting room had leaked. Particularly Diana's insufficient stamp on Hannah's CV, Laura's stapler puncturing through Hannah's documents, Greg's mocking laughter. It all spread clearly. Social media went wild. Hashtag Justice for Hannah. Hashtag StormX Scandal. Hashtag Character Over Clothes became worldwide trending hashtags in a matter of hours. Everywhere, people were talking about Hannah's wet blouse, the papers scattered across the floor, yet her unwavering posture. On one side, the masks of those who had considered themselves elite for years were falling, while on the other, a simple but powerful stance was touching the hearts of millions. One user wrote, "Those who judged based on first impressions ended up digging their own graves. Nobility isn't in showmanship, it's in your stance." Another said, "A woman can change the world, not just with her looks, but with her intelligence." Hannah proved that. Hannah didn't appear in front of the cameras for days. She didn't give interviews, nor did she make statements. Instead, she quietly went on with her work. Because she never walked for applause, she believed in doing what was right with every step. However, the winds of change had already begun within the company. Under Elias' instructions, StormX Tech underwent a radical reform. Hiring policies were completely revamped. Resumes no longer sought just school names or job titles, but real stories of success. Internal training programs were launched. The principle of zero tolerance for discrimination was put into practice. The most notable change was the creation of the Character First Leadership Program. And, of course, Hannah became the founding coordinator of this program. Her name was now echoing, not just on the walls of the company building, but as a source of inspiration across the entire industry. But Hannah didn't change. Every morning, she still wore her simple clothes, as always. She still walked to meetings, getting her coffee herself. She still greeted everyone with a humble smile. Because Hannah's battle was never with others. Her battle was with the silent strength she nurtured within herself every single day. From the outside, it might have seemed like just a few people had been fired. But in reality, this event had sent a shocking message to the entire industry. True leadership wasn't hidden in labels, it was in actions. And Hannah's silent steps had shifted a massive system. Months had passed, but the images from that day were still circulating on the internet. On every platform, Hannah's drenched figure, standing tall despite it all, her CV stained with the inked word insufficient, had been etched into the public's memory. It was being used as a case study in career development seminars, discussed in university classrooms, and shown in internal training videos as a cautionary tale. But for some, this wasn't just an inspiring story. For a few, it marked the beginning of a destruction that would change their entire lives. Diana could no longer wear her red jacket. The elegant demeanor, the sharp stares, the image of the charismatic HR director, all of it had crumbled. When her name came up in search engines, it was no longer associated with her successes, but with the word loser she had written on Hannah's CV. The woman once known as a career hunter was now on LinkedIn, marked as job seeking, but no offers were coming her way. In every interview, people raised their eyebrows, and they couldn't help but ask about the viral video of Hannah. Greg fell even faster. He had to sell his stocks. That expensive Rolex watch he trusted so much was even pawned off to pay off debts. Even the companies in his own ecosystem had blacklisted him. The man who had torn up Hannah's code and thrown it away was now going door to door handing out his CV. But the irony? His own resume was now the one that was torn digitally too. Luca, the arrogant investor's son. His last name had opened doors for him for years. But after the video of him pouring water on Hannah went viral, even his family couldn't defend him in the media. He was kicked out of his family's company. The smug smile on his face when he laughed at Hannah now turned into the embarrassment of rejecting every interview request. The business world no longer wanted him. Investors avoid risks when investing. And Luca had become nothing more than a reputation risk. Laura fell the most quietly. The moment she punctured Hannah's documents with the stapler, it was analyzed in slow motion by a TikTok user. It was labeled mechanical violence against intelligence. The woman who had tried to present herself as intellectual with her glasses was now the industry's ironic villain. Her own algorithms had started to filter her out. Some hiring platforms automatically rejected her applications. And Mark, the least talkative but the one who kicked the hardest. When Hannah bent down to pick up her files, he had stomped on them with his foot. This image, representing Hannah's silence, was shared thousands of times. The caption, proof of how small they are with what they thought was power. Mark eventually gave up. He had to quit his career and move to another country. But that mark, the booted foot that stood over Hannah's crushed papers, could never be erased from his identity. These five had attacked not just a woman, but a value. And in return, they lost not only their jobs, but their reputations as well. But Hannah never mentioned their names in any interview. Not Diana, not Greg, not Luca. Even though media offers were made to her countless times. Name names, we'll get more views. But Hannah always said the same thing. This is not a revenge story. This was a test to make people relearn how to think. And in that test, the loudest voices were the ones that lost the most. The one who remained silent made history. 6 months later, Hannah walked through the bustling streets of the city early in the morning. She wore the same simple trench coat, a pair of old but clean shoes. She hadn't changed, but with every step she took, the world around her had. Hannah was no longer just the silent hero of Stormex Tech, but of the entire industry. Invitations poured in. International conferences, leadership summits, universities. Everyone wanted to talk about her simple yet unwavering stance. But Hannah was selective. Instead of collecting applause on grand stages, she chose to mentor young people, quietly support new talent. Because for her, success wasn't about shining under the spotlight, but lighting someone else's path in the dark. That morning, after a busy day, she walked into a small cafe to grab a coffee. And, by the strange twist of fate, that moment was waiting for her. At one of the tables by the window, an unkempt man sat staring out at the rainy glass. His worn coat, messy hair, and cracked cardboard cup in hand. When he looked up, Hannah recognized him immediately. Greg, the man who had once mocked her in Stormex's meeting room. Now, his eyes were darkened, his face weighed down by the years. In his hands was a small cardboard sign with words that tugged at the heart, unemployed. Can you help? A mix of emotions passed through Hannah. There was no pity, no anger, just a silent understanding of life's cycle. She went to the counter and bought 2 coffees. Then, she walked over to the table where Greg sat. She placed the coffee in front of him. Greg looked up, and when he recognized her, his eyes widened, his voice faltered. I. Hannah tilted her head slightly and spoke in a calm voice. A coffee is an act of kindness. It's not for me to question whether you deserve it. Greg's eyes filled with tears. He wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. Hannah took something out of her pocket. A small, shiny coin, etched with barely legible writing. Justice. It was a special token given as a reward by Elias from his desk at Stormex. It was an award for character, not success. Hannah placed the coin in Greg's palm. As he grasped it, he started to cry. But Hannah didn't stop. She simply smiled silently, lifted the collar of her trench coat, and disappeared into the rain again. Her steps were quiet, but with every step, something echoed behind her. Power. As she moved away from the street, people passed by her without recognizing her. Hannah had never sought attention. Real heroes don't walk for praise, they walk to do what's right. And that morning, once again, Hannah walked to her own silent summit. As a woman who had brought down those who rose in arrogance with her silence, reminding the world of one thing. True power grows most when you remain silent. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next inspiring story.